So, in yesterday's video, we discussed how MPs voted to delay Brexit and force the government to give Parliament more time to debate and scrutinise the new deal. We mentioned at the end of the episode that we weren't sure what Johnson would do next, and then news emerged that Johnson had officially sent a letter requesting the extension. So, in this video, we're going to discuss Johnson's plan going forward and the letter, or letters, that Johnson sent to the EU. Before we do, just a quick shout out to the podcast. In case you don't know who I am, I'm Ben, one of TLDR's lead writers, and I also appear on the podcast most weeks. Our podcast, Too Long Didn't Read, is where we discuss issues in more depth and go off on all kinds of tangents, usually because of me. So if you want more analysis from us and to see a bit more of our personal sides, then check out the podcast. It's available on most platforms, so either search the show or find the links in the description. Anyway, back to the video. The Ben Act is a law that was passed by MPs in September. It required the Prime Minister to ask the EU for another extension to the Brexit deadline if he wasn't able to get a deal passed by Saturday the 19th at 11 p.m. Due to the delay MPs introduced via the Letwin Amendment, the government couldn't hold a meaningful vote on the deal, and, as such, Johnson had failed to meet the terms of the Ben Act. This meant that Johnson was legally obliged to write a letter requesting an extension from the EU. This is something he clearly didn't want to do, famously saying that he'd rather be dead in a ditch than ask for an extension. So, because of that, many people were speculating and theorising how Johnson could circumvent the law and avoid writing the letter. One popular theory was that Johnson would send two letters, the first being the obligatory letter asking for the extension, and the second being a letter from him saying he doesn't want the EU to accept the offer. In the end, this theory is pretty much exactly what happened. Johnson actually went further, sending the EU 3 documents, 2 letters and 1 covering letter. The first letter was the one requesting the extension, one that Johnson didn't actually sign. The second was his letter which said that an extension would be a bad idea, saying that an extension would be deeply corrosive. And the third, a cover letter, came from the UK's ambassador to the EU. Let's go through those letters one at a time. The first, which is unsigned, is a request for an extension. It's fairly likely that Johnson decided not to sign a document as he didn't want to break his promise by requesting an extension. In fact, it's been reported that he told EU officials the letter was from Parliament rather than himself. This is legally absolutely untrue, and the extension request, as mandated by the Ben Act, came from Johnson himself. The second letter admits to distance himself even further by making it even clearer that he doesn't support the extension. He said the government will press ahead with the ratification and introduce the necessary legislation early next week. So Johnson is still optimistic that he will be able to get the deal across the line without needing an extension. In fact, he even says this later in the letter. He also rejects the idea of the extension, saying a further extension would damage the interests of the UK and our EU partners, and the relationship between us. Going on to say, we must bring this process to a conclusion so we can move to the next phase. At this stage, there's a certain amount of debate about the legality of this action. Some legal experts say that by sending the second letter, Johnson is subverting the intention of the law. The law says that he has to request an extension, and while he's technically done that, by sending the second letter he's gone against the spirit of the law by saying he doesn't actually want the extension. It's very likely this will lead to some kind of court proceeding against Johnson and his government, but for now at least it's unclear how that will play out. There's also more uncertainty on the EU's side of things. Just because the UK have asked for an extension doesn't necessarily mean they have to grant it. The extension would need the unanimous support of all 27 member states, and some think it's possible that a member might veto the extension. However, we likely won't know for a few days as the EU doesn't have to respond to the request until the current deadline at the end of the month, so it might be a while until we know if the extension's even been accepted. As I said, these are both contentious and debatable issues. Did Johnson break the law? Will the EU allow an extension? If you want to hear more from us, then that's exactly what we'll do in the latest episode of the podcast. Alternatively, you can subscribe to the channel where we'll continue to unpack the extension and the legality as it plays out.
You can also hit the bell icon if you want to be notified every time we release a video. And if you want more from us, you can find TLDR across all social networks simply by searching for TLDR News. And if you want your name featured at the end of the videos, just like these people, then you can sign up to back us on Patreon. There's a link to that in the description.